Hello, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining me.
It was a pleasure. It's always nice to talk to you.
Well, in the course of your work, you've actually uncovered a scandal that is really worthy of its own book, and it's a tale of censorship and suppression, and you've been fighting it rather bravely for many, many years. I want everyone to understand the story we're about to tell, so I want to take you back to 2011 when Southampton University actually purchased the Broadlands archive. What was in the Broadlands archive?
Well, the Broadlands archive was a huge collection, I think regarded probably as the second most important collection after Churchill's papers at Churchill College, Cambridge. And it included some material from the 19th century, the records of Lord Palmerston. But the real jewel in the crown were the papers of Lord and Lady Mountbatten. Mountbatten had been the last Viceroy of India. And these constituted, literally hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of files. He kept everything going back to his childhood, but also, very important for a biographer, the personal letters and diaries of Mountbatten and his wife, and the correspondence between Edwina and Nehru, the Indian Prime Minister with whom she had an affair from 1947 until her death in 1960. So a huge collection of importance to historians really studying the 20th century, but also studying the Second World War and also Indian independence.
So Southampton University actually spearheaded the public fundraising campaign to purchase this collection. And millions of public funds, is that fair to say it was in the millions?
Yes, absolutely. £2.8 million was used to buy the collection. There was also what we call acceptance in lieu, which is basically a tax break to the Mountbattens for this material. And the donations came from the local county council, from some charities, a real mixture. But a lot of public funds were involved. And the whole focus of the fundraising campaign, which was led by the archivist there, was that this material should be saved for the nation and should be made available to scholars.
And it was supposed to be absolutely available for public access to scholars. Anyone that basically applied to view it should have been allowed to view it. But that wasn't the case. And it was actually, you yourself were prevented from viewing it. You actually applied to view it in 2017, I believe. And did you have an expectation at that time that it wouldn't be a problem, that you would actually be granted access?
Yes, I thought there would be no problem, partly because other scholars had used this material before 2011, before it was bought, in effect. It was on loan, or it was at Broadlands, which was Mountbatten's country house. So quite a lot of this material had been quoted in books, but also we had two official lives of the Mountbattens, which had quoted extensively from the collection. So this material was in the public domain. So I was surprised to be told that, first of all, they knew nothing about these letters and diaries and had no contact details for the Mountbatten estate.
And so you knew that this was sort of a bit of a suspicious denial because you knew what should have been there. One thing that surprised me was that it wasn't catalogued as soon as it hit the Southampton University archives. Is that extraordinary that it wouldn't be catalogued as soon as they received it?
Absolutely. One of the great mysteries is, having fought so hard to get this collection, and it was spearheaded, as I say, by one particular individual, that nothing was done with it. And he even claimed later that he hadn't even bothered looking at it, which I find hard to believe, or he'd skimmed it. You don't spend years raising money for something that you desperately want to bring to a university to then abandon it as soon as it arrives.
And does Southampton University have the sort of courses where are future historians studying at Southampton University?
Yes, they make great play in enticing people to Southampton, that they have these collections, that they use primary sources in teaching undergraduates. In fact, this archivist became a sort of professor of archival studies. So they make a great play of this material that is available to scholars, except it's not.
So you would think that they're not really getting taught best practice, because I'm not an historian, yet I would think that the first thing I would do would be establish what was in the collection and secure it by cataloguing it. So that to me is suspicious in itself. Do you think it could have been a catch and kill operation where it was designed to actually purchase the collection in order to bury it? Or do you not think that's the
No,
case?
I don't think it's a catch and kill. I mean, I think it's a panic. And when some of the material arrived, after they had their cursory look, they saw references to the royal family. And we still in this country have such a deferential approach, or some people, to the royal family that everyone just panicked. But I mean, I think there's very bad governance here, because anyone on the council, the independent scrutiners, the non-execs should have said, you've spent all this money to get it here. Why aren't you doing anything with it? And I'm surprised that this huge history department there didn't say to their colleague, we'd love to look at this material, because it covered so many different areas. As I say, the Second World War, because of Mountbatten's role as Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia and involved in special operations with combined operations, his involvement in D-Day. We had all the material to do with India and the nascent independence movements at the end of the Second World War. We had him as Chief of Defence Staff. So, I mean, almost anyone in the history department covering the last 100 years would have wanted to look at this material. And what happened? Were they pushed away as I was, or did they just not care?
So this archivist at Southampton University, you were told that it was because of a ministerial direction that you were prevented from looking at this material, whereupon I think that was the point that you asked to see the original purchase agreement, because that should have been a key bit of evidence to prove that actually the parts of the collection that you wanted to actually view, which was the diaries and letters, should have been exempt from any ministerial direction. It shouldn't have applied. And actually you found that there shouldn't have been any way for there to be a ministerial direction over this part of the collection. So you requested that purchase agreement and you got it, and it was heavily redacted. You basically couldn't make anything out. So how do you get something unredacted? What's the process?
Well, the process is you need to put in a request, another FOI, and you have to challenge it. The problem is you don't know what's redacted, so you don't know what your arguments might be. But this was a deliberate ploy. This material was not released to me until it's still not released to me. But over the years, gradually, I've got more and more. I've actually got a case now in the first tier tribunal, which is the court for information, freedom of information, in which I'm taking the information commissioner, who now increasingly is siding with public authorities, though it's meant to be the regulator, challenging this purchase agreement. And I'm being accused of being vexatious. So the problem is, if you don't take no for an answer and keep going, they just say you're a nutter and you're vexatious. And that's the line the ICO have taken. But what has emerged, even at this stage, because we know that all the confidentiality elements to the contract have now ended, is that it was very clear that this material that was purchased was what was called open. They claimed it was closed, but it's now very clear it was open. So this was a direct lie, not just to me, but to the courts. And I think one of the other shocking things is that this ministerial direction, which required them, they claim, to defer to the Cabinet Office, which is the ministry responsible to the royal family, as well as basically the intelligence services and everyone. This ministerial direction no one could ever find. None of the FOI requests in the government departments could discover anything about it, who had signed it. And indeed, basically their bluff had been called. And just before the hearing that we had, they dropped the ministerial direction. But by that stage, I'd spent about £300,000 addressing it in the course of lawyers. And this seems to be completely wrong.
So I want to take you back to 2019, where the Freedom of Information Commissioner she instigated High Court contempt proceedings. Now, at that point, you had to lawyer up. And I didn't really understand why you had to lawyer up. Shouldn't the Freedom of Information Commission actually be fighting this fight for you? Why do you as an individual have to take on the responsibility of this fight?
Well, I shouldn't, and you're absolutely right. The problem is the Information Commissioner reports, and its budget is determined by the Cabinet Office, the very people that they were regulating. So they pulled their punches. And so I was joined in the action but the action, you're absolutely right. What happened was the Information Commissioner ruled in 2019 that Southampton and the Cabinet Office should release this material, that it should be made available. And that was appealed by the two public authorities. Everyone says I brought the action. I didn't. It was brought against me as an appeal. But I was forced to lawyer up because the Information Commissioner was doing nothing. But you're absolutely right. In a separate issue, the Information Commissioner began contempt proceedings against Southampton for failing to answer them. I mean, they were very, very disrespectful to the regulator. Now, the grounds on, for example, in these cases for getting your costs is if there's been unreasonable behavior by one of the parties, or one of the parties has succeeded in achieving what they wanted. And in fact, I don't want to go too far forward, but I did achieve in what I wanted in defending this appeal. And I think there was unreasonable behavior by Southampton.
Yes. And I was astounded too that when you got to that final tribunal hearing, that just prior to that, 30,000 pages of this material was published on Southampton University's website. And it was really bland, boring, innocuous sort of stuff. So you had spent all those years fighting for access to material that you thought was so highly sensitive and so important that all these impediments were being put in your way, and it was nothing. And 99% of it was released. They didn't give you the courtesy of telling you that they were going to release it, yet they knew you'd spent hundreds of thousands of pounds trying to get access to this material. So that to me was just a really contemptuous act. Then on top of that, just before the final appeal, the judge gets swapped out. So you lost the judge that knew, the history of this action. And the new judge ruled on the basis, now the whole point of your argument was the fact that the ministerial direction was, if it even existed, was it valid? And that you'd been fighting the good fight on that for many years. This new judge just decided that it existed. And not only did it exist, but that Southampton University had to abide by it. So she just completely didn't even address your argument, found in their favour. What did you feel at that point? Were you angry or were you despairing?
Well, I was certainly frustrated. Frustrated also because I had no money to lodge an appeal. If I'd been able to appeal this decision, it was a victory because, as you say, I got 99.9% of the material, 33,000 pages, the biggest ever release of FOI material. So this was a victory, and it was, my book had long been published, but this was an important victory for other historians. I think one of the sad things is that no one was prepared to stand up and support me. There were no support from organizations beyond a cursory letter from the Royal Historical Society. The odd parliamentarian who picked up on this and included a former foreign secretary wrote a letter, was panned off with a series of lies and dropped it. But there were no letters to the papers. There were no letters of support to me. I raised a little bit of money from a sort of a crowdfunding activity, but £75,000 out of 500,000 is not very much. I couldn't get pro bono legal support. My lawyers insisted on being paid to the very last drop. And even when it came to the appeal, I'd hoped maybe they might do it pro bono. They refused. So I couldn't appeal. I had no more money. I'd liquidated all my assets. A legacy from my mother had been spent. All my savings had gone. I'd had to remortgage the house. Everything had gone fighting this case. Now, you may say it was mad to do this, but I felt also that until I was the only person who could conclude this case, and I expected, and I think we all expected, that I would be awarded my costs in the circumstances. So that was the real blow, to have this judge, as you say, replacing the other one, not just before the hearing, actually sometime before, which is a very odd decision, because normally judges are replaced because another trial is continuing and they are longer than they expected. There could be no reason to replace a judge in February for something that was coming up in November. So one does begin to wonder if there was something going on behind the scenes.
And because you couldn't afford to appeal, you couldn't get your costs reversed because you had to appeal the decision in order to be able to appeal. Now, that level of money is wounding to anybody in any circumstance. And I imagine that took a great personal toll. But I can see that you were stuck in this position where you were halfway through a fight. And I mean, really, you were just throwing good money after bad because you already had spent hundreds of thousands of pounds anyway before you even got to the final tribunal. So you were probably holding out for a fair and just outcome.
That was certainly my understanding. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding was that in order to get the costs, I had to finish the job. Now talking to other lawyers, they said that I should have been advised by my lawyers to stop the matter once the material was released before the hearing. But of course, lawyers are, when they're being paid, are not going to take you off the case. So,
No.
but again, you can't take any action against lawyers. Any attempts to in these circumstances would lead to nothing. They're pretty much self-regulated. And my research indicated that only if there'd been some deliberate fraud, in some ways, if my money had been taken away from me or something, could I have done anything with the lawyers? So I was sort of caught. And I'd hoped that someone would come forward, some sort of rich benefactor who believed in freedom of information, in access to archives, in academic or against academic censorship. But alas, no one did come forward. And so I had to shoulder the whole thing myself.
And in the process of this, you've exposed that you said that no other historians or people of note really came forward to help you or support you. And I believe you have a theory that it might have been that it's only historians that are in favour, that don't rock the boat and don't cause any trouble, that are granted access to material. And you've seen that time and time again in your life. And so do you think that, has anybody approached you, awfully embarrassed and ashamed, like a fellow historian, realising the fight that you fought and what you've actually achieved? Has anyone, had the decency to even approach you privately and apologise for not backing you?
Well, occasionally, there have been sort of three reactions. They haven't approached me directly, but once or twice I've heard from other people that when this case came up, people have said to them, gosh, he's got guts to go through with this. I wouldn't have done so. But they've not said anything to me directly. There have been others who have basically studiously avoided me at events, who I was afraid of, who are clearly embarrassed. And then there's a third lot who have been actively or behind the scenes briefing against me. So, for example, when my next book came out, a book on Edward VIII, none of the broadsheets reviewed it. And I learned later, they did eventually, but they didn't for the first 9 months. And I discovered that people were telling there was nothing new in the book. Now, you've read the book, you can see there's quite a lot of new material there. So there's quite a lot of this. But you're absolutely right. There's a lobby system that operates where those who basically do the bidding of their masters are given access, are given quangos and various sort of rewards. And those who don't play ball are marginalized, attempts are made to discredit them. They're depicted as nutters, it's a lone obsession. And so you're painted into a corner. And it's a bit like, being in gangs at school. And sometimes people choose to be in the more dominant gang and people get pushed aside.
Yeah.
So
That must be really isolating and very lonely. It must be awful. I can't imagine what that would be like. And also, on top of that, you've had to be, you've monitored by Cabinet and is it the Foreign Office and Cabinet monitoring you? And you found this out by actually putting forward a subject access request. Can you explain to everybody that doesn't know what a subject access request is?
Well, under new data protection rules in this country, we have this thing called a subject access request, and you can put in a request to a public authority to see what material they hold on you. And I did this with the Cabinet Office. I discovered they refused to answer it, saying that they would take them 600 hours to discover this material because they had so much material on me. So I then restricted it to a 6-month interval. They eventually provided some material. They're meant to give you the full context of these this material. They did not do so. They just gave me odd little headings. But from that, it appeared that all the talks I gave to bookshops, to alumni organizations, to book festivals were being monitored. My social media was being monitored. At that point, I had two court cases, one an employment tribunal and one a defamation case brought by a disgruntled former employee who I'd sacked for stealing from my business. And they were monitoring that. They were collecting anything, I think, that they could find any dirt on me or any vulnerability. But I also found that they were briefing, for example, the cabinet secretary incorrectly. They were briefing the press incorrectly. They made a whole series of claims, for example, that this material would always been released, that my efforts over 6 years were completely unnecessary. They claimed that the papers of Mountbatten, he had agreed to have his private diaries and letters censored by the government, which was untrue. There were a whole series of lies, which didn't know about until I got this material. I've now put in another case at the First Tier Tribunal representing myself to force the Cabinet Office to release more information, to give me more context. But they put up a defense again that I'm being vexatious, and on the advice of friends of mine who are lawyers, I've dropped that case, because the last thing you want is to have a judgment against you as a vexatious litigant, which they'll deploy against you every time that you try and raise something.
Well, does that make you frightened? I mean, it would make me frightened.
No, it just makes me more determined, but I just wish there were more people prepared to stick their head above the parapet. And no, it makes me more bullshit and angry. And I'm not a natural rebel. I'm, I would say a pretty law-abiding citizen. And it is rather chilling that law-abiding citizens are being monitored in this way, and they lie about it. I don't think that will change with a change of government. I think it's part of the secretive nature of our society. And I feel very strongly, not just as a historian, that this material should be open, that our history is being censored, but I feel as a private individual that we have to have accountability and transparency in our institutions if we are to place our trust in them. And I'm afraid this is sadly lacking at the moment in Britain, and I suspect has been for many years.
It astounds me that it is in Britain that it's happening. It just is not somewhere where I would think that this would happen. And like you've said, I've heard you say in other, interviews that it's like you're living in a banana republic, because you just wouldn't expect this to happen. Now, you've asserted that government departments are also failing to deposit records as they should, when they should, into the National Archives. And when they do, again, we've got this inventory cataloguing problem where files are missing, but half the time you can't tell what's missing because nothing's catalogued properly anyway. And so how did this situation come about? Has it always been this bad?
Yes, I think it has always been this bad. And it's just that people are beginning to look at it like me. But we have a legal obligation, the government, to put records into the National Archives within 20 years of them, unless they fulfill certain exemptions, national security, relations with other countries, data protection. But that's not happening. Now, partly that is down to resources, but they can deploy huge resources against someone like me. The cost of this action against me, the cost of buying these documents was 2.8 million. It was probably very similar to stop me seeing them. But they are not releasing the documents. It's not just that, but I'm finding that many documents are destroyed. They keep no public record of what is destroyed, something like 80% of files. Now, some are duplicates, some are administrative files, but who is to decide? So, for example, doing Traitor King, there's one important file on Wallis Simpson showing that she had a lover at the time of the abdication, and indeed he had too. Which is always quoted. But I talked to the sensitivity reviewer, the man who was responsible for releasing it, and he said, well, there were dozens of similar files on Wallis, which were destroyed at the same time at the beginning of the 21st century, with no record being kept, because they felt one representative file was important. And so they were making the judgment themselves. This wasn't historians, this was the Met Police. I found, again, during that research, that the Colonial Office files covering the period when the Duke of Windsor was governor of the Bahamas were very, very thin. Often you'll find things in the index which are not there in the bulk of the file. When I went to the Bahamas, I found a much fuller file, so that it'd clearly been weeded for the National Archives. And there were quite embarrassing things there. For example, during the Harry Oakes murder case in which the Duke was involved, he had actually posted the Commissioner of Police to Trinidad to avoid him giving evidence in the trial. So there's a huge cover-up going on, which is abetted by civil servants and archivists, who, after all, should be about making information available, not suppressing it.
Yes, because it's distorting and censoring history, which is ludicrous, because how can we ever know what really happened about anything if that happens?
We're used to the present being censored, but we don't expect the past to be censored. But we have an even more worrying development in that files which were open are now being closed. So in the course of requesting a protection file, the Duke of Windsor, from the 1930s, but dozens of these files had already been released, they give basically incidental detail about his travels. I was told that if this file was released, it would affect the present safety of the royal family. I challenged that. The Information Commissioner agreed with the Metropolitan Police. I again represented myself in the first-tier tribunal. And the judge said to me, well, show me these 20 files that are so innocent. I ordered them from the National Archives and found that they'd been reclosed. First of all, they said they weren't available. So they were out to another researcher. Eventually, I pushed it and said, I ordered these files weeks ago. And they eventually said they're used for a trial. Anyway, I won that case. So my original file has been released, but these 20 other files 2 years later remain closed. So we're going backwards. And there's something like 5,000 files last year, possibly more, were closed on the say-so of junior members of staff with no oversight at the National Archives. So, and these are files that have been copied, have been used in television programs, are widely available. So it's kind of stopping the shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. And their argument is that terrorists will go into the National Archives, will plough through thousands of pages of documents, and be able to mount a successful outrage against the royal family, given technology has not changed since 1920 or the 1930s. It's a ludicrous argument.
It is ludicrous. And a similar silly story is after our late Queen died, the Footman was actually allocated the job to go through Queen Elizabeth II's private papers and to decide what would make it to the Royal Archives and what wouldn't. Now, it just blows me away. I can't believe it. Yes. I mean, can you imagine what will be destroyed and what will be thrown out that is vital to the history?
Well, absolutely. And one of the problems with Royal Archives is the division between what is a public family archive and what is a public archive to do with their duties. But there's a whole history of this. I mean, many of Queen Victoria's papers were destroyed by her daughter. The Queen Mother's papers, many of them were destroyed by Princess Margaret. The Duke of Edinburgh spent the last few years of his life, they said, sorting out his papers. Well, sorting out his papers meant sticking a lot of them in an incinerator. And so, again, we're getting the picture they want to present. We have this picture of this very benign monarchy, shaking hands and playing the PR game very well. But in fact, they're absolutely ruthless, and they're protecting their brand and their image. And they know that they can get away with all sorts of mischief because they can hide behind these FOI exemptions. There's one specifically for them. And they know that a tame press and frankly, tame historians will not challenge any of this. I mean, it may sound extraordinary to Australians who behave in a different way, not always brilliantly, I have to say. I think you're charging now archivists to look at papers in some of the archives and limiting what they can see and in terms of how much they can see at each time. It's the Royal Archives is private in effect, and they can have whoever they want in to look at it. So I know lots of people who have not been allowed to look at it. I suspect that if I was going there for the first time now, I wouldn't be allowed to look at the Royal Archives. But the fact is, I've been using them for 40 years. It would be very difficult for them to stop me going in. But even then, they tried to slow me down. And I could only go in once every couple of months. I couldn't book a block booking. They claimed they were full. And yet every time I went in, I was often the only researcher there. So they find all sorts of ways of blocking people looking at material. So there are lots of devices they use, whether it's access to the archival research departments themselves, or the use of FOI exemptions. And I
when
know
you go into the Royal Archives, I think many people watching this would be really interested to get that sort of eye view, to go in there and just to have that experience. So when you go in there, do you have to request certain documents that you're interested in, and then you only have access to those? Are they sitting on a table or something when you go in? Or how does it unfold?
The process is you say, I'm doing the Duke of Windsor. What have you got? And they will tell you what they want you to see. There's no inventory. There's no public inventory. So you say, fine.
There's no inventory?
No.
So you can't request specific files?
No, you don't know what's there. It's like going to a restaurant with no menu. You just get given something.
That's crazy. It's crazy.
It's a big battle. It's a big battle to get access to the stuff because they clearly have it. So you do your order and you book to go, and you have to get a pass. You turn up and you have to go and collect a pass and have various bits of authority to show who you are. And though I've been going there on a regular basis for 40 years, every time I have to go and show my bits of identity to show that I'm still Andrew Lownie. And then you walk through the main gate and you walk up the hill past St. George's Chapel, up to the Round Tower. You climb the steps up to the Round Tower, being buzzed in by the security. And you're taken to a very elegant room with various tables. And as you say, the files are put in boxes on the on trolleys for you. You're not allowed to use a camera. Everything has to be taken down in notes and pencil. There are very strict times. You have to wash your hands before you go in. You have to take a lunch break. They opened at 10 and they close at 4, I think. So your day is quite short. And I feel very sorry for Americans who've come across to do research. But the Royal Archives don't believe in long working days. They have their work-life balance perfectly organized. And then you take your material down. Then you have to send your material if you want to quote it. So you can paraphrase it, but if you want to use quotes, you have to send it for their clearance. And there was a time when they checked that you did your footnotes properly to make sure you which is fine because you want them to be accurate. They now, I understand, let you, if you leave material to be photocopied, they will photocopy it for you. But from my experience, that takes months. So it's much easier just to make notes. So yeah, that's the Royal Archives.
Oh, wow. I mean, I'm jealous because I think it would be an amazing experience, but also I understand the frustration of how it's all set up. And I've heard you say in interviews that in the USA, it's a lot more efficient. It's a lot more transparent. You can get access and it's seldom really you're rejected. Would that be accurate?
Well, it's a mixed picture. So the book that was published in 2015, my book on Guy Burgess, I again used extensive US records. And now some of those requests from 2013 earlier are still being processed by the FBI. They still haven't produced the records from over a decade ago. And I'm quite skillful at asking for only a limited number of records, which means you should get them more quickly. But you're absolutely right. When you go into archives in the States, they will often, if you say, look, I'm looking at this, they will say, well, we haven't got it, but you should go somewhere else. You'll never be given that sort of information here. It's semantics. If you don't phrase your question accurately here, whether it's in an FOI or in a visit to an archive, they won't give you the material. If you ask for letters and they've got telegrams, they won't say, by the way, we have telegrams. You just won't see them. So it's a completely different attitude to opening archives. The Americans are also very good at digitalizing material, allowing you to see material and they'll send it to you, sometimes at a price, sometimes for free, which I have been arguing for a long time we should do in this country. It would protect the archives themselves, the material. It would allow them to see many more researchers, and it would clearly make it much cheaper for researchers because at the moment, if I go to, perhaps 40 archives around the world, that's a huge travel and accommodation bill, which I could just do it from home.
Yeah, exactly. Now, did the harassment of you start post Guy Burgess' book, or did it really start with the Mountbatten book?
Well, because my requests are every 6 months, I haven't gone as far back as Burgess. I think it was the Mountbatten book, the fact that I kept going and was quite vociferous in my comments about freedom of information and its suppression. I think that's when they began to monitor me. Their argument is that they, should monitor what, I wouldn't say I'm a public historian, but what people are saying. But I think this went way beyond monitoring what I'm saying, which I say very openly, and they could read my social media, to monitoring my movements and, in effect, my private life.
Right. Okay. I want to take you, just before we wrap up this episode, I hope to have you back and talk to you more in depth about the Mountbatten's book, because I've got so many questions about that book. But you accessed the FBI files, and the FBI created these files on Lord Louis Mountbatten in the 1940s. What was he doing at that time that would make them so interested in investigating him?
Well, in 1943, he was appointed as Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia. He was he had, for example, MacArthur reporting to him. He was dealing with a lot of American generals in the chain of command, and I think there was some interest in him because of that. But the FBI file I discovered was a chance encounter. A woman was brought in who was part of the sort of social scene of Queen Mary to be interviewed about something else, and she just dropped en passant the fact that Mountbatten and his wife were people who led lives of very loose morals, I think they said, and that he had an interest in young boys. And this, I think, made the FBI pick up their ears, and then they began to investigate further. But there was other material being reported to them from other informants. And this wasn't an attempt for them to find information. It was just collecting information that was being reported. There was a lot of gossip going around. And there was a man who ran a private intelligence service called Grunbaum, who was used by them, and he reported similar stories. So the result was that there were files on Mountbatten and his wife, who was suspected of being a communist, right through from 1943 through the 1950s. And I know that because I've seen the file numbers and some of the references to them in the collection. But one of the again shocking things was to discover that these files, which had been kept until 2018 from the 1940s, had suddenly been destroyed. And when I asked why had they been destroyed, they said, when had they been destroyed? After I'd asked for them. This is a strange thing because they could easily have just cited the Section 27 relations of the foreign country and said we're not allowed to release them. And this was one of the reasons that some of the material on Mountbatten in the hearing was not released, because we know that Edwina had described Jinnah, the Muslim leader, as a psychopath. And the argument of the government was if this material was released, it would inflame relations with Pakistan. Now, 75 years later, even though her comments about Jinnah are in the public domain and well known.
Right. And so it's extraordinary that you were actually told that they honestly destroyed the files after you asked for them. So they wanted you to know.
Yes, I think the Americans were upset. I think, they wanted this word to get out.
And so that's because they believe in free speech, presumably. And also access to information. So who ordered them to destroy those files?
Well, we can only speculate. I have put in requests on that and they haven't been answered. But one can only imagine that when they realized that this dealt with a British subject, that they pushed this across to the British government and said, there's been a request for material, what should we do? And the British just panicked and said, oh gosh, get rid of them. That we can only assume that's what happened. That would be the only reason, because otherwise why not just send them to me?
I did wonder, because I've read both those books, and I did wonder if there might have been some sort of crossover between the Cambridge Five and Lord Louis Mountbatten and Edwina being a communist and, well, an alleged communist. I was just wondering whether that's what they're scared of, that they're scared you're going to find some sort of connection, which would be very embarrassing, particularly as Lord Louis Mountbatten was so high up, particularly during the war.
Well, I mean, you're right. I think, but then they could have cited national security. We wouldn't have known what national security was involved because he was Chief of Defence Staff. That has no public interest test. So they could have used other exemptions to avoid releasing material. I mean, they used one called health health and something else, which they've used several times against me. One, which is a case now going, we hope, to the appeal court, where it's about a vetting file for someone who I think was part of the Cambridge spy ring, and they wouldn't release it because they said it would drive his son to suicide if he knew his father was a spy. This person is a public figure, which is a slightly strange argument, given that, for example, the Archbishop of Canterbury discovered that his father wasn't who he discovered, that there have been several other cases. A High Court judge discovered his father was a Russian spy. So there's a precedent there. But who knows what they're doing? I mean, certainly talking to one of my Russian contacts, he claimed that Mountbatten was a spy called Admiral. For the Russians. He'd been compromised because of his paedophile activities. I didn't put that in the book because I couldn't verify it. But a number of people, quite separately, have come up with similar allegations against Mountbatten, that he was working for the Russians, a betrayal of other operations. I would say about 4 or 5 people, but it's all hearsay, it's all secondhand. So it's very hard to find the information. And that's one of the problems. The sensitive material is often destroyed, and you're relying on oral history in order to tell the story.
Well, I would like to invite you back again because I want to speak to you about the Mountbatten book. And in particular, now you've said that there's that rumour that he might have been working for the Russians, I'm wondering if that actually explains Dieppe, and because that was sort of done on behalf of the Russians wanted that to happen, didn't they? So, I mean, this is fascinating. This is really good. We're going to have to delve into this. I will let you go for now, but I am going to get you back and we'll delve into all of that in the next episode.
Well, I look forward to it. Lovely talking to you.
Okay. You too. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Now you've said